This is a compilation video of Quickies that were once uploaded to my main channel. I moved them off there since they were cluttering the place up between my main videos. While I have divided each of them up based on anime season, there may be some things from other anime seasons mixed in there, as I may have watched things that were from a prior season during that one. You will find timestamps for each anime talked about in each of these compilations in the description. Thank you! Anime finished this year number 57, Housing Complex C, 4 out of 10. Okay, so I'm making a video about this one now, but I actually finished it way back when it aired at the end of October. I honestly just kept forgetting to talk about it. And that's part of the problem. This one isn't super memorable. I even had to skim through the 4 episodes to refresh myself on what happened in it, since a lot of the first few episodes just did not stick with me. I think the pacing is what really killed this show for me. I was initially excited to see something that was going to be a light and breezy 4 episodes long and didn't overstay its welcome, but by the end it felt like it should have had more episodes. The first 3 are languidly paced, dragging over the same ideas over and over to try and get them to stick with you, with a bit of shock horror sprinkled on top of some eldritch horror implications. Then episode 4 comes in like a truck, spends the first half info-dumping the whole lore to us, followed by a frankly rushed and uninteresting conclusion that leans more heavily into that eldritch horror. On second thought, maybe more episodes wouldn't have helped if they were just going to drag things out more like the first 3 did. There is some attempt at social commentary here, but I think it's a bit poorly handled. Take this all with a grain of salt, because I am very white, though I would love to hear some POC folk talk about their take on this. While I did find it refreshing to see a show actually take on Japan's xenophobia, it was really on the nose here and super heavy-handed that made it stand out that they were trying to make a point. At most, it was a why can't we all just get along take, which, while nice, doesn't address the underlying issues or systemic ones. It ended up really never making a point and felt more like it was thrown in there as a makes you think, doesn't it kind of moment. There's also the issue that while there are several characters of color here, only 2 of them get any significant screen time and only 1 makes it to the end of the whole lot. This leaves the rest of them being used basically as props for that message that goes nowhere and pawns for the schemes of another character. All that to say, I just don't think this was a very effectively done horror piece, and it ended up feeling sloppy with the ideas it did try to tackle. Granted, it's only 4 episodes, so it's not a big time investment if you're curious about it. In fact, I think it does play better when binged together rather than when I had to sit through it week to week. But at that point, why not just trim it down a little and make it into a movie instead? Anime finished this year number 58. I'm the Villainess, so I'm Taming the Final Boss. 6 out of 10. Man, is it good to see some shoujo anime airing again. This isn't the only one this season, but this was the first premiere, and it's also the first to wrap up, so let's talk about it. This falls very much in line with the typical ideas of a Villainess reincarnation story. For a lot of people, their first encounter with this might have been My Next Life as a Villainess, but it's actually an entire subgenre of light novels, manga, and manhwa. One that I have to admit I have a bit of fondness for, even if I don't think all of them are the best thing in the world. And this one's pretty okay. If I were judging purely on the first and the final arc, I'd love this show a lot more. However, the second arc that takes up the 4 middle episodes of this series is really what keeps me from recommending it more highly. It's not that the second arc is awful or anything, but it very much drags and doesn't do much except introduce a few small elements and far too many side characters. Those side characters are something of a problem, since most of them are pretty flat and don't have a ton interesting going on. There are 1 or 2 that I ended up liking, but many of them pale in comparison to the buckets of personality that our main lead, Eileen, has. She's great, I really like her a lot, but the fact that she is so fun and dynamic means that any character that can't really match her energy or banter properly with her ends up falling into the background and kind of all blurring together. The only interesting thing about that second arc is the twist that comes at the end of it and turns a lot of what we've been looking at on its head. I personally find the twist really interesting in the way that it takes away a lot of the game knowledge that Eileen has been relying on, twisting what she would expect to happen so that she can actually be caught off guard. This actually leads into a really fun finale to the whole experience. However, the other character that is involved in this twist never really gets explained. While their function is fun and interesting, the fact that they do nothing but serve that function and we never learn their motivations makes things feel kind of rushed. I think that the final arc could have been well served by one extra episode to flesh some of this out. Where the second arc drags, the first and third can seem pretty rushed at times. Anime finished this year number 59, Reincarnated as a Sword, 5 out of 10. This is one I'm kind of of two minds about, and it really sucks that it ended up that way. You see, I'm a big fan of wholesome parent-child adventure kind of stories, and in the lead up to this show, it was pitched around like that by anyone who was trying to convince others to watch it. The problem comes from the fact that that is only one aspect of this series. I loved that part, but everything else that surrounds it was a really mixed bag. Let's start with the good. A lot of the characters were really likable. While I'm not attached to very many of them, it wasn't like I was upset when we had to spend a scene with them either. Everyone's very pleasant, which I appreciated. A few of them are a little too eager to help out Fran, which can end up feeling a little bit more like plot contrivance to get her what she needs, though. The relationship between Fran and Shisho is really nice and definitely the highlight of the series. Fran herself is actually maybe my favorite part because she has such feral little goblin energy to her, and I love when little girls are allowed to just be feral little goblins and nobody puts them down for it. And I suppose I should give the series a lot of props for just killing slavers with no ceremony or remorse in the first episode. A lot of fantasy anime could learn from that instead of being ambivalent to it, or even worse, participating. However, there's about an equal amount in this one that I just didn't enjoy. First of all, it's a case of overpowered main characters happening again. Granted, there's a little tension when the two of them were separated, but if that's the only way to stop their combo, I end up finding that pretty boring. Because of the way this is set up, they're also just racking up skills and magic left and right, quickly enough that it feels really unearned. There are so many things that are learned, used once, and then just forgotten about because between then, 3 other techniques were learned and those also need to be shown off. While I love Fran, I don't really love the way she's treated in this show. I understand it's realistic that when buying clothes they'd need to buy her underwear, but there's no reason for the show to bring it up unless it wants us thinking about a 12-year-old's underwear. I never see that specific realism come up with male characters. Then comes the new outfit she gets in the last episode. Short shorts, thigh highs, crop top. I thought the show was going to call this out when Shisho got upset about her stomach being out, but the second he's shown it has a magical barrier to protect her and it's justified, it's dropped. That's bad lampshading to point something out and then just do it anyway. Finally, the world building sucks. I hear it's better in the novels, but I haven't read them, so I can't comment on that. What I do know is that I'm sick and tired of isekai worlds where things run like a game. The sheer number of stat charts shown in this show was ridiculous. While there are a few points where things are done cleverly in fights, the fact that everything is a skill or has stats is just so boring to me. It takes me out of the world every time that it came up and makes the whole thing feel so fake. Anime finished this year number 60, Mob Psycho 100, Season 3. 10 out of 10, prior seasons 9 out of 10. Honestly, what can I say about season 3 of Mob Psycho that I haven't already said about the other two? The animation is a masterwork, just like the other seasons, with perhaps even more off-the-wall techniques that make it stand out so much in the anime landscape these days. The writing is just as superb, delivering not only laughs, but also moments that make me feel intensely deeply. It's really the complete package. What's funny to me is that the biggest triumph of this season is also something of its greatest downfall as well. This season contains a lot of really big payoffs for things from prior seasons, going all the way back to the beginning of the show. On one hand, that's a great way to call back to all the growth that these characters have had, but on another, if you haven't watched those seasons in a long time or your memories of them are a little hazy, it might not work as well as intended. It's not a problem for me, since I watched the prior seasons for the first time just this year, but I could see it being an issue for other people. Granted, that does mean that a binge of the full series is going to be a really amazing experience for anyone starting it now. Once again, I find myself in a position that while the animation of the climactic psychic fights is absolutely insane and a treat to watch, the personal stakes are what make those moments feel impactful to me, not any of the impressive fight choreography. but I think that's a testament to just how strong the character writing is in this series. Honestly, to me, my favorite little moment of animation, despite all the cool stuff that was done, was the moment where Shigeo cries in the last episode. It's wonderful that this manga got not only a full adaptation, but such an excellently done one that takes advantage of the opportunities afforded by animation. I think the fact that this show was complete and ready before the season even started, rather than having a constantly looming deadline each week, really served it well, and I hope the anime industry might learn from that. Anime finished this year number 61, Akiba Maid War, 10 out of 10. If you had told me at the beginning of the year that an anime about maid cafes was going to be in my running for anime of the year, I don't think I would have believed you. After all, I'm not someone who entirely gets the whole maid cafe thing. I understand it as an occasional novelty, sure, but I can't understand the idea of going to one over and over again on a regular basis. There was also a spot in the middle of the year that had like 3 shows that all featured girls in a cafe in some form, and I was starting to feel like it was a bit overdone. So what did Maid War do to make it interesting again? It turned it into a Yakuza movie. Obviously. Akiba Maid War is set on the backdrop of the maid cafe boom of the 90s, where supply is clearly outpacing demand, so the maids are turning to violence to make sure that their turf is staked out and the money keeps flowing through their doors. It imagines a whole seedy underbelly hidden away under cutesy layers, just barely out of the eye of the public. I wasn't sure at first, but it really grabbed me by the end of the first episode, when a brutal takedown of an anime cafe was shown off like a choreographed dance, complete with backing track and all. It was wonderful. Every act of violence done with the whirl of a petticoat. There are some parodic elements here for sure, turning the whole thing up to levels that I don't think anyone would have expected it to take from the outset, with a sprinkling of dark humor laid over the top of the whole affair. However, what really astounded me and made it so special is it was able to have these episodes that made me laugh out loud, but also deliver episodes that were honestly heartbreaking to watch, and moments that hit with all the weight and drama of a more serious mobster flick. That is an incredibly tough balancing act to pull off, and Maid War does it excellently. It also treats the characters with the seriousness that they deserve. Aside from a tiny handful of shots, the maid costumes aren't sexualized when the girls in the show are wearing them. They're treated like the battle armor that the characters treat them as. I really appreciated that. It would have been so easy to make this a sort of trashy late-night fan service vehicle, but they didn't, and it was very much to the show's benefit. Like I said, this is one of my contenders for anime of the year. It was that good. If you missed out on this one for some reason, be sure to give it a watch when you have the chance. Anime finished this year number 62, Do It Yourself, 6 out of 10. Ah yes, the resident cute girls doing cute things with camaraderie show this season. This one is just a slice of wholesomeness that was served up every week, and I'm certainly not upset about that in the slightest. It can sometimes be a little hard to sort out the best of the best when it comes to these shows because, let's be honest, there are a lot of cases where it's the same show in a different font. I might not think that this is the best of the genre, but for what is here, I had a good time. The activity in question this time is DIY projects, which I'm sure you could guess from the title. I was a little worried when starting out that this was going to be more fluffy little things, but no, these girls were breaking out the power tools in the first episode, which I really appreciated. They were collecting their own materials, making blueprints and everything. They made some jewelry, sure, but they also made stained glass and built a bench out of materials they had on hand. As someone who has done shop work before, it was really good to see girls with drills. The one weakness to this, though, is that not a ton of time was spent on the projects themselves. There were a few times where the work that went into a project was explained in more detail, but many times the work that each of them was doing was just montaged over. On one hand, I understand the need for this for the sake of giving time to character relationships, but on the other, it could make their projects feel a little incidental at times, like you could have replaced them with anything, aside from the final project, which they spend near half the season building up to. There's also a bit of a problem in that the relationship between Serafu and Purin was supposed to be the central relationship of the series, but so much time was spent on the relationship between Purin and Jobko that it ended up feeling like the more major relationship in the series a lot of the time. Part of that is due to time spent, but another part of it could just be that Serafu is a fairly passive character a lot of the time due to her lackadaisical personality. Jobko is much more active and thus much more likely to be doing things with Purin directly, especially once they live together. It didn't break the series or anything, obviously, but it did feel like a bit of a flaw. Anime finished this year number 63, Bibliophile Princess, 7 out of 10. This one was just very sweet, the kind of thing that I was looking to get out of a shoujo romance with this color palette and character design. Ellie looks like a cupcake a lot of the time, and the mood she gives off is just as sweet. It's not perfect, but it's fine for what it is. One of the bigger flaws is that a lot of the events that happen over the course of the series can feel a little disconnected, but from what I was able to find out, this may be because the show chose not to adapt full novels, but instead parts of them, skipping over other parts. I haven't read them myself, but I do have to wonder if a more full adaptation would have smoothed things over a little bit more. The first few episodes were pretty solid, but after that, things started to get shaky, particularly in the middle of the season. I would say that the first and final arc are the strongest, but that's not even for plot, but more for character interactions and relationships that we see put on display at those parts of the story. The bigger problem is that Ellie is not only our protagonist, but our point of view character. Now, there's not really anything wrong with Ellie. I think she's a fine enough character, and there are some really fun moments with her. The problem is that she doesn't really actively do much in the plot. I don't think she's a completely passive waif or anything, but often the plot propels her rather than her propelling the plot. She'll have moments of conflict, sure, but there aren't a whole lot of them. The biggest reason for this problem is the time skip that happens early in the series. It makes sense because it's only after 4 years of engagement to the prince that things really start getting put into motion after all, but there is so much that we are told she did during those 4 years that made her into an influence both socially and politically, but we never get to see those, just the results that came sometime later. So it can feel like the show is just pulling things out of a hat at times and using what we have not seen in the time skip to justify it. There's also the fact that Christopher is often off doing his own thing, so we only get to hear about his impact later when it actually impacts the plot. I hear the books go on to just get more and more political in nature, so I can only hope that a potential second season gives her a little bit more to do. That said, Ellie is still a great character, and her relationship with Prince Christopher is a real delight to watch. It was what kept me watching even through some of the duller plotlines in the middle of the season, after all. The way he teases and prods, but she falls for it so much of the time, is really cute, and the genuine affection that bloomed between them without her even seeming to notice at first is nice. I like the idea that she's finally taking her nose out of books and noticing the people around her. I just wish I got to see a little bit more of that. Anime finished this year number 64, Raven of the Inner Palace, 9 out of 10. Of the handful of shoujo shows that we got this season, this one was definitely my favorite, even if I'm not very well versed in the ins and outs of Chinese court dramas. This might have actually gotten me in the mood to check out a few more, though. Granted, this was a little less about the courtly intrigue and plots, and a little more about a supernatural undercurrent running through it all and the ghosts of the palace. But it was all still really engaging. The mythology did take a little bit to get into, but once we had the full background of everything laid out, a lot of the pieces of why things were set up the way they are started to fall into place, which was really great to see. In particular, I was really happy to see a different style of animation used for the flashbacks. It made them both visually distinct and far more memorable. It was a really creative touch that made the show stand out a little more from others of its kind. While I would have been fine with the story staying fairly episodic and just tackling the many, many ghosts that are around the inner palace, I was glad to see it move into tackling a little bit more to give things stakes. While it was fun to see our lead deal with these supernatural matters, at the same time, there needed to be some stakes that were more personal to her, and the series definitely began to deliver on that in the back half. I'm also pretty fond of the romance that's starting to happen here, so I'm crossing my fingers. The only really big problem I have with the series is the fact that it's just not really a complete story. By the end of all 13 episodes, there are some questions that are still left unanswered, and the final episode had a decent helping of teasing for a potential season 2. It looks like there's 7 volumes to the series, but from what I saw from someone who had read them, the show didn't even fully get through volume 3, so there might be plenty of content to continue on with. If they do, I'm highly looking forward to it. What's nice is that it's another one of those series that I love, where a lonely girl ends up building out a support network of people who come to genuinely care for her. All it took was one person to be a little persistent, and everything about her lonely existence changed. If anything, it has me looking forward to trying out the light novels myself when their translations drop next year. Anime finished this year number 65, Boochi the Rock, 10 out of 10. I'll be honest, this was a show that I was pretty sure I wasn't going to stick with at the start of the season. The way it starts is pretty slow, and even as someone who can sometimes relate to the catastrophizing that Boochi does, I was really worried that the gag of her not being able to handle human interaction was going to wear thin really fast. But then, something interesting happened. Boochi began to grow. It wasn't a big thing, just little steps here and there, but it was clear that even with how much the show liked to joke around about her, it was also allowing her to make tiny steps of progress over time. I really appreciated that. Gag shows like to keep their characters static, but by giving her those steps, this had progressed past just gags for me and into something that ended up becoming genuinely compelling to experience. The cast is a really big part of that. Boochi is fun and all, but the people who are around her are not only varied, but have their own things going on that I really love. It's not a show just about how everyone relates to Boochi, but so many other characters have their own web of relationships to one another. They also represented different levels of extroversion and introversion and social struggles, making it clear that Boochi is not alone in not having it all figured out quite yet. What makes this show truly special, though, is the way that the adaptation was handled. Because this was initially just a series of 4-panel comic strips, there's a lot of comedy, but there's also a lot of room to play around and expand on the source material, and the staff of the show seemed to take great pleasure in doing that. Every joke is set up and animated in a way that is either most visually interesting or funny. It really elevated the source material to another level. It's one of those cases where while I like what I've read of the source material well enough, I'm sitting here and hoping for another season because it really feels like a whole new experience in the hands of this team. Anime finished this year number 66, Chainsaw Man, 8 out of 10. So I have read all of part 1 of this manga, and I have to say that while I understand why some people are so crazy for it, I don't think it hits me quite the same way. I've seen this show get hyped to hell and back in the actual lead up to its premiere, and as a result, I can totally understand why someone might feel it doesn't live up to all that hype. Honestly, even when it was just the manga being hyped, it didn't quite live up to that for me. Perhaps that's because the fights and the big plot twists aren't what appeal to me about this series. I prefer some of the smaller elements, like the dynamic of Denji, Power, and Aki all living together, the relationship between Aki and Himeno, the relationship between Power and her cat, and just in general, the way that this is fundamentally a series about a whole bunch of messed up people just kind of trying to do their best, with both the hand that they've been dealt and the situation that they're in. That appealed to me far more than any of the chainsaws or fights or sprays of blood. Obviously, it's nice to have a plot moving forward for the elements that I like to play against, but the plot isn't what really kept me watching or reading. I cared more for moments like Aki bribing Denji and Power with gum than any action scene. Speaking of Denji, I have to admit I don't like him as a main character very much early in the show. On one hand, Denji is an interesting case in that a lack of human connection in his youth has led to him seeking it out now that he actually has a chance. However, being a teenage boy influenced by others and the culture around him, he has assumed that means he wants sex, kissing, touching boobs, etc., when what he really wants is intimacy, but he doesn't have the understanding or vocabulary to really process that, which is an interesting look at the pervert protagonist. That all being said, on a surface level it does come across as a guy just wanting to cop a feel a lot of the time, and this element does take up a decent amount of screen time. Even with my understanding of the character, I still find it kind of annoying, as that's not a type of character that I particularly enjoy. though I must concede he has a better understanding of consent than some other anime characters. There's also moments in the series that end up coming off like they're in there just for some cheap shock value comedy, like what happens when Denji does get his first kiss. It's not something I entirely enjoy, even if in some cases I can understand their place in the story. It's little moments that end up reminding me, oh yeah, this is a shonen story made for teenage boys. I expect I will end up liking the somewhat inevitable season 2 and beyond more. I've actually found that a lot of shonen action these days doesn't seem to grab me in the first season of adaptation, but this one did hold my interest better than most do in that regard. Oh, and by the way, the series looked stellar. I don't know what everyone was on about when it came to the animation not being good enough for them. It's exceptionally done. Anime finished this year number 67, Spy Family Core 2. 9 out of 10. The last core was also a 9 out of 10. God, this is such a good show. The second core was just as good as the first, though there were some parts of it I didn't end up liking as much. To be honest, anytime we go a significant amount of time without Anya around, it seems to be the parts that seem to lull. Like, sure, I like the spy stuff well enough, but the tennis arc was likely my least favorite part of the season, even if I do like Fiona. The characters added in this part of the season were all great and welcome additions to the cast that open up some nice avenues to do fun things in the future. However, that doesn't mean I still love all the characters in this show. I understand the purpose of Yor's brother Yuri, but that doesn't mean I have to like the trope of a brother being in love with his sister. I get that it's played for laughs and it's never taken seriously, but something like Fiona's dynamic with Lloyd in the family is just better to me because it doesn't have the gross sibling angle going on. Speaking of Yor, I have to admit that this part of the season still disappointed me with her. She doesn't get a whole lot to do outside of fretting if she's good enough for the family and making strides to do better in that regard. Granted, that content is still interesting and I like getting to know her better in that part of her life, but the fact that her assassin work keeps feeling incidental to her character, despite being a big part of the premise of the show, is a drawback. However, as a manga reader, I take comfort in knowing that that content is coming and will likely be in the recently announced second season. What I found really interesting, though, is the way that this show handled slotting filler in. There's a lot of plot points that don't quite fill out an episode enough, or would be strange to cut in half across 2 episodes, so the show dances around this by having little filler moments to fill out the episodes properly, and adjust to make the pacing of canon moments feel more consistent. And the thing is, it's really good filler. Most of it was indistinguishable if you didn't know otherwise, which just goes to show how much love has been put into this show and how much the staff understands the content that they're working with. Also, it's just plain gorgeous. The openings and endings for this core were phenomenal, not only musically, but visually as well. I didn't skip them a single time. There is a lot of love and care being put towards this series, and as a big fan of it, I love that a whole lot. I cannot wait for more.